We're continuing in our journey through the Gospel of John to prepare for the Christmas holiday. Our series has been entitled When Heaven Came Down. This is the fourth part, God in the Flesh. In his book, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, author Douglas Adams describes what he imagines it would look like if the ancient Norse, the mythological Norse god Thor, the god of thunder, were to actually show up in time and space of human history. Now Thor is really in vogue these days with the recent popularity of the Avengers movie series. Some of you have seen the Thors. Yeah, awesome stuff. But as I read at length to you from Douglas Adams' book, which actually predates the movies by a couple decades, you're going to need to filter out your mental image of the Chris Hemsworth Thor, and just try to go along for the ride as Adams describes what he thinks it would look like if the God of thunder actually stepped into time and space. Now, as I read this, I need a guy who's going to volunteer to do this. I need you to provide on cue, this godlike, God of thunder, masculine, guttural, Bob, you're into this. You've got the Thor hair, too, so I need you to come up here. Let's give Bob a hand. All right. We'll have you come right over. Why don't you come over here? So I'll give you cues. The God of Thunder. God of Thunder, a.k.a. Bob. Okay. All right, so the chapter opens as follows. All right, a little more. Oh, that is awesome. Bob, the God of thunder. All right, so Thor lets out a bellow of rage. It made the sky shake, and the heavy clouds let out a surprised grunt of thunder at the sheer volume of air that moved beneath him. And he hurled his hammer to the ground right at his very feet. You could act this out, too, as we're going. That would be fun. Okay, so you're hurling your hammer to the ground with both hands with such astounding force that it hit and it rebounded into the air about 100 feet. Okay. And with an immense explosion of air from his lungs, he hurled himself into the air, 100 feet, okay, caught it as it was just beginning to drop, and he hurled it straight back down at the ground again, catching it again as it bounded back up, twisting violently around in midair, and hurling it with all force he could muster out to the sea before falling to the ground himself on his back, pounding the earth with his ankles, elbows, and fists.
On my back.
He's on his back, pounding the earth with his ankles, elbows, and fists in an incredible tattoo of rage. You're way too happy. You're doing a great job. He's doing a great job, isn't he? All right. Okay, cue it. Okay, that's the cue right there. Okay, so the hammer shot out over the sea on a very low trajectory, and the head went down into the water and planed through it, and a sharp ripple opened slowly but easily across its surface, extending eventually to about a mile as the hammer sliced its way through like a surgeon's knife, and the inner walls of the ripple deepened smoothly in its wake, falling away from the sheer force of the hammer till a vast valley had opened in the face of the sea. And the walls of the valley wobbled and swayed uncertainly and then folded up and crashed together. The focus is on the hammer right now, so we'll get back to you in a second. All right. And it crashed together in this crazed and foaming tumult. And the hammer lifted its head and swung up high into the air, and Thor leaped to his feet and watched it, still pounding his feet on the ground like a boxer, but like a boxer who was perhaps about to precipitate a major earthquake. And when the hammer reached the top of its trajectory, Thor hurled his fist downward like a conductor, and the hammer hurled down into the crashing mass of the sea. Well, that seemed to calm the sea for a moment, in the same way that a smack in the face will calm a hysteric. The moment passed. An immense column of water erupted out of the smack, and seconds later, the hammer exploded upward out of its center, pulling another huge column of water from the middle of the first one. And the hammer somersaulted at the top of its rise. It turned, spun, and rushed back to its owner like a wildly overexcited puppy. And Thor caught at it, but instead of stopping it, he allowed it to carry him backward, and together they tumbled back through the rocks, so you can crash through the wall, about 100 yards, and scuffled to a halt in some soft earth. And instantly, Thor was back on his feet again, and he turned round, and he bounded from one leg to the other with strides of nearly 10 feet, swinging the hammer around him at full arm's length. And then when he released it again, it raced out to the sea once more, but this time it tore around the surface in a giant semicircle, causing the sea to rear up around its circumference to form, for a moment, a gigantic amphitheater of water. And when it fell forward, it crashed like a tidal wave and ran forward and threw itself enraged against the short wall of a cliff. That is so awesome. The hammer returned to Thor, who threw it off again instantly in a great overarm. It flew into a rock, hitting off a fat, angry spark. And it bounded off farther, and then hit a spark off another rock, and then another, and Thor threw himself forward onto his knees, and with each rock that the hammer would hit, he would pound the ground with his fist to make the rock rise up to meet the hammer, and spark after spark erupted from the rocks, and the hammer hit each successive rock harder and harder until one spark provoked a warning lick of lightning from the clouds. You better stop. Right? And then the sky began to move slowly like a great angry animal uncoiling in its lair. And the pounding sparks flew faster and heavier from the hammer, and more lightning licks arced down to meet them from the sky, and the whole earth was beginning to tremble in something very like fearful excitement. And Thor hauled his elbows up above his head and then thrust them down hard with another ringing bellow at the sky. And the sky seemed about to crack open. And Thor threw himself to the ground. Yes! And as he did so, he heaved aside about 2 skipfuls of rocky earth, and he shook with expanding rage. And with a deep groan, the whole side of the cliff began slowly to lean forward into the sea as he pushed it and shook. And in a few seconds more, it tumbled heavily into the seething torment beneath it as Thor clambered back, seized a rock the size of a grand piano. Why don't you go ahead and pick up the piano just to demonstrate? And held it above his head. Everything was still for a fleeting moment. And then Thor hurled the rock into the sea. He regained his hammer. He bellowed. He did it again. And he cracked his hammer down, and then a torrent of water erupted from the ground. The sky exploded, and lightning flickered down like a white wall of light for miles along the coast in either direction, and thunder roared like colliding worlds, and the clouds vomited rain that shattered the ground, and Thor stood exulting in the torrent. What was that all about? A bystander asked. Thor replied, I just needed to be able to lose my temper properly. All right, great job, Bob. What a sport. I think you worked up a sweat. It's hot up here. I just needed to lose my temper properly. Now, why in the world on Christmas Sunday did I spend all this time on complete nonsense of the God of thunder. Well, this is the connection with Christmas Sunday. The Christmas season is when we celebrate the fact that the real God of thunder actually stepped into time and space of human history. Do you know the Bible actually does connect the real God of heaven with thunder? We see that in dozens of places actually throughout the Bible. In Psalm 37, 1 through 5, we read these words. The author of Job, "My heart pounds as I think of this. It trembles within me. Listen carefully to the thunder of God's voice as it rolls from his mouth. It rolls across the heavens and his lightning flashes in every direction. And then comes the roaring of the thunder, the tremendous voice of his majesty. He does not restrain it when he speaks. God's voice is glorious in the thunder, and we can't even imagine the greatness of his power." Now that is nonfiction. That is the true God of heaven, the true God of thunder. And Christmas is when we celebrate that this true, unimaginably great and powerful God of heaven and God of thunder actually stepped into time and space of human history. Now, if you were to write the chapter in a book of what you think it would look like when the real God of heaven and the real God of thunder invaded our space, if you were to write what it would really look like as you would imagine it, if God were to step into and invade your airspace, what do you think it would look like? What are your expectations? How would he show up? What would he look like? What would he say? What would he do? Think about that for a moment. Now, I think that if many of us were honest, the arrival of the true God of heaven and the true God of thunder, his advent, his coming into the world, I think if we were to be honest about what we think that might look like, I think our imaginations might not be that different than Thor's incredible tattoo of rage that we saw very well demonstrated up here, right? I think that's a conception a lot of us have. I think that many of us would honestly expect that if God were to show up, invade our airspace, that he would devise some sort of way to properly lose his temper. Oh, man. See? Right there. Oh, man. Oh, man. Now we got to relight the Bethlehem candle and the angel candle. Oh. You know, there's prophetic symbolism of it. This is the Christ candle, right? And we're studying John 1, and it said the darkness can't extinguish the light. So, hey, yeah. Good. We're going to put... You got to come Tuesday night if you want to see the Christ candle light for real. Thanks. I was wondering. Amen. I don't. Where were we? Oh yeah, tithing. Just kidding. Just kidding. Well, actually, where were we? What? I have no idea where we were. What would it look like? I think a lot of us would truly imagine that if God showed up, there would be this incredible tattoo of rage, that sparks would fly, and that the earth, the sky, the sea would all resonate with this, chorale of violent convulsions, just in response to this overwhelming rush of wrath, of God showing up in our airspace. Isn't that what a lot of us think it would look like? And as for us lowly human beings, when he showed up, heads would roll. Heads would roll. when the true God of heaven and thunder invaded space. And so, yeah, I think if we were to write our chapters, this is what I think is really going to happen when God shows up. Bob, one more time. Yeah, right? All right, I won't ask for a show of hands, but yeah, good. But I think that's a lot of our conceptions of what it's really going to look like. Years ago, I had a very vivid dream. I'll never forget this. And I think this sort of revealed, my own heart's, fears of what it might look like when the God of heaven and thunder actually showed up. And in this dream, I was in a church service, and we were all worshiping together. And during the time of worship, God just ever so slightly parted the veil that protected the realm of human existence from his unbearable power and holiness. He just very slightly split the veil, and in a split instant, the whole room was flattened to our faces on the floor. Just a little peek of God's presence in an instant. And it wasn't as a voluntary gesture of reverence, but it was this involuntary concussion, of just the holiness of God exploding in the room. And we were crushed to the ground, like a rag doll that had just had like this grand piano dropped on it. It was a terrifying dream. And I think that's kind of maybe what's deep in my heart as to what I think it might look like if the real God of heaven, the true God of thunder, were to invade our airspace. Well, this is our connection with our text this morning in John chapter 1. Our imaginations of what it would look like if God were to show up really aren't that much different than the expectations of those who were living at the time of the very first Christmas, when the God of heaven and the God of thunder actually did show up. And as we've seen over the past few weeks in our journey through the first chapter of the Gospel of John, that when John opens the Gospel with these words in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. When John wrote this, he was borrowing language, the language of this Word, capital O-R-D. He was borrowing that language from the predominant philosophical and religious expectations of his time, and primarily just from two groups that were in the backdrop of the advent of the God of thunder, the philosophical Greeks and the God crowd, the religious Jews. And this is what our passage had to say to those crowds as they would have read it, about the God of thunder, the Word stepping into time and space. For the philosophical Greeks, their word, as we saw a couple weeks ago, was this impersonal, abstract ideal. They really believed there was this word, and it was this impersonal, abstract ideal, something like the Force of Star Wars. May the Force be with you. May the Word be with you. Or like chi of modern Eastern spirituality. And so for the Greeks, this concept of the Word, this abstract ideal, invading time and space, it just didn't fit. It just didn't fit their categories. They would have had no expectations that their word would or could even step into time and space. And in fact, for the philosophical Greeks, the time and space of human existence was the realm of darkness. It was the realm from which we needed to emancipate ourselves, and we did that, according to the philosophical Greeks, was by thinking right thoughts, and doing the right things, choosing to do good things, to discipline, to subjugate the desires, the lower desires of our flesh. All right? Does that make sense? So for the Greeks, the philosophical Greeks, reading John 1 at the time it would have been written, the flesh was what we needed to be emancipated from. We needed to be set free from the flesh. We needed to escape the flesh. We needed to escape our condition of human frailty so that we could become or attain, or at least try to obtain, the realm of the Word, to become like the Word. But for the Greek, for the philosophical Greek, the Word doesn't become flesh. That's crazy. You get it? You get that? And so now you can better understand how, when the Apostle John wrote these words, so the Word who is from the beginning, the Word who was with God, the Word who is God, the Word became flesh and made his home among us. The philosophical Greeks would be like, the Word became flesh? That's crazy talk. That is absolutely absurd. The impersonal, unknowable, perfect, abstract, out-of-reach Word could never become knowable in any real way, in any personal way. And even if the Word could become knowable in a personal way, it wouldn't. Even if it could, it wouldn't. The perfect Word would never defile itself and become this frail, flesh and blood human being. The Word doesn't become flesh. That's absurd. Absolutely absurd. That's how it would have landed with the Greek reading it at the time. And here's our point of connection with us, okay? This is our point of connection with us. Some of us today are still very philosophically Greek in our expectations of God showing up. We're still philosophically Greek in our expectations of God. Many of us still believe in our heart of hearts that somewhere out there is this impersonal, unknowable, abstract, and out of reach Word who's somewhere way out there and who could never and would never become knowable to us in any real and personal way. Some of us are still very philosophically Greek because we believe that in our heart of hearts. Or even if we believe that he could do that, many of us doubt that he would do that he would invade our airspace and make himself knowable. And he certainly wouldn't defile himself by getting anywhere near to the messes that you have made of your life in the frailty of your flesh. Right? Right? Many of us are still philosophically Greek in our expectations of God. Some of you struggle with the feeling that you could never find a microphone big enough or an amplifier loud enough to push your heart and to push your prayers and to push your cries out there far enough to be heard by this impersonal, abstract, unknowable, and out-of-reach God that's somewhere out there. Some of you still believe in that God. Here's the absurdity of Christmas for you. The absurdity of Christmas is that the infinite, eternal, transcendent Word came to you. He came to you, personal, knowable, tangible, with ears that hear and eyes that see and a mouth that talks and hands that touch and a heart that feels and arms that embrace. The Word became flesh and made his home among you. That's the absurd thought that I want you to wrap your heart and mind around this Christmas. Some of you struggle with the feeling of constant failure, of never just being able to think yourself right enough to get yourself out there to the Word, to behave yourself right enough and do it well enough to get yourself to the Word. And the absurdity of Christmas is that the perfect Word came to you. The Word became flesh and made his home among you in the mess that you have made of your life, in the frailty of your flesh. Some of you struggle with the feeling that God doesn't even get what it's really like to live in the frailty of flesh, that he has no idea of what it's really like to duke it out in the trenches of life and struggle with the things we struggle with and be hurt by the things that hurt us. And the absurdity of Christmas is that the Word became flesh, a flesh and blood human being. And he camped out in our neighborhoods for a lifetime, walking in our shoes, experiencing the very same kinds of pains, facing the very same kinds of temptations, the author of Hebrews tells us. The Word understands the pains and struggles of duking it out in the trenches of life, in the frailty of our flesh. That means that Jesus gets you. He gets what you're going through. Doesn't shake his head, cross his arms like, what is your problem? Why can't you get it? The Word gets you. That's the absurdity of this Christmas truth, that the God of thunder became flesh and made his home among us. That's what the Word says to those of us who are still philosophically Greek in our believing about God. Now, there's another crowd here. There's another crowd there in the biblical text. Going back to that very first Christmas, in contrast to the philosophical Greeks, there was the religious crowd, the God crowd. They too were anxiously awaiting the arrival of their word, but their word, in contrast to the impersonal, abstract force of the philosophical Greek, for the religious crowd, their word actually was going to be a personal person and a vindictive person. When the religious crowd's word showed up, heads were going to roll. Sparks were going to fly. The prince of darkness would be utterly defeated in this epic cosmic battle. Heads were going to roll, and bad people, which would have included, by the way, people like you and me, bad people, the sons of darkness, including those stinking Romans who were occupying the promised land at the time, they're going to get squashed like bugs by the word, by the Prince of Light when he showed up, and utterly annihilated forever. And so for the religious, for the God crowd, when the word showed up, he was going to be packing some serious heat, and it was going to look a lot like Thor's incredible tattoo of rage when he showed up. And so, understanding that backdrop behind the words of John chapter 1, you can understand how, for the God crowd, reading this affirmation of the Christian faith about this word that they're looking for, this word that they're waiting for to swing his axe, lop off heads, and to hear John write these words. This word, when he became flesh, he showed up and he was full of unfailing love and faithfulness. What? This is scandalous. What John wrote about the Word, in contrast to the expectations of the God crowd, it was absolutely scandalous. He showed up full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we've seen his glory. This is the smash you to the carpet glory of God. We've seen his glory. And it didn't smash us to the carpet. It's the same glory of the Father's one and only Son, and from his abundance we have received one gracious blessing after another. Not one violent whooping after another, but one gracious blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the unique one who is himself God. The unique one, the Word, Jesus, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart, and he has revealed God to us. And what did he reveal when he showed up in flesh and blood? The God of glory, the God of heaven, the God of thunder, and when he showed up and revealed, this is what I'm really like. Unfailing love and faithfulness. What? We thought heads were going to roll. We thought sparks were going to fly. Scandalous. Well, what's our point of connection this morning? Well, like some of the original readers of the first chapter of the Gospel of John, I think that there are some of us today who are very much, in our expectations, expecting that when God shows up, heads are going to fly, right? Sparks are going to fly. Heads are going to fly, sparks are going to fly, body parts are going to fly, right? I talk to people all the time who just live in fear of the God of heaven. I talk to people all the time who expect that when God shows up, they're thinking they're going to be the ones on the opposite side of a sword, a hammer, crashing down on their heads with a... You might be somebody who is still in that very religious expectation of what it would look like when the God of heaven and the God of thunder shows up in your airspace. Well, this is the amazingly scandalous thought that I want you to wrap your heart and mind around this Christmas. That when the God of heaven, the God of thunder, the Word, when Jesus Christ showed up among us, he became flesh and blood. He pitched his tent right in our neighborhood, and he was full of unfailing love and faithfulness. And we have all received from him one blessing after another. Gracious blessing, gracious blessing, gracious blessing, gracious blessing, gracious blessing, gracious blessing, one after another. The religious people fully expected this angry, out of control, vindictive God. And the two defining characteristics that John said, the Apostle John, the disciple who laid his head on Jesus' chest, said, let me tell you what the God of glory is like. He's full of unfailing love and faithfulness. I've seen it. I've touched it. I've heard it. Some of you struggle with the fear that God showing up in your life is going to be a smackdown. He's coming after you with a baseball bat. Little price tag you have to pick up. And the absurdity of Christmas is that God has come, he's coming after you to pour out on you one gracious blessing after another. Wrap your heart and mind around what it really looks like when God shows up in your life. Some of you struggle with the fear that the failures of the frailty of your flesh, that the failures of your life have just gotten on God's last nerve, that he's completely out of patience with you and he's done. He's done. Don't pray to him. He's done with you. Don't try to do any good deeds to get in his good graces. He is done with you. Don't pray. He's done. And the absurdity of Christmas, the scandal of Christmas, is that God has come. He's become one of us. He's made his home among us to show you unfailing love and faithfulness. Some of us struggle with guilt. Some of us struggle with shame. Some of us struggle with bitterness. Some of us struggle with unforgiveness and cannot even imagine how God could not come to us with a hammer in his hand. And the absurdity and the scandal of Christmas is that he's come to show you unfailing love and faithfulness. Some of you struggle with just this feeling that if God shows up, all he will say to you is, get it right. Get it right. You loser. Why can't you get it right? And the scandal of Christmas is God did show up, and he was full of unfailing love for people like us who can't get it right. Full of faithfulness. That's what Christmas means. That's what it means that the God of heaven and the God of thunder actually did step into our airspace. Wrap your heart and mind around that this Christmas. Let's stand.